Morning, everybody. My name is Larry Gastiger. I'm the executive director at Wires. Had a great event last night. Hope folks who were able to make it enjoyed it. But we've got a great program for you today with continuing in the Wires tradition. We have top-notch speakers coming in to talk about issues related to transmission. And I think we've got a really good program. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the Wires president for this year, Jody Moskowitz from PSEG, and she will introduce our keynote speaker. So, Jody.
Thanks, Larry. Good morning, everyone. It's hard to believe it's been only a little over 3 months since we last met in Chicago. It seems like there's so much that's happened in the industry in the interim. We're in a time of a changing regulatory landscape with the confirmation of 3 new FERC commissioners in June, Judy Chang, David Rosner, and Lindsay See, which brings the commission to its full complement of members. In the days ahead, Wires looks forward to meeting with the commissioners and engaging in constructive dialogue to understand their perspectives and priorities while explaining and advancing the core mission of our members, which is to maintain reliability for our customers. At a special meeting in May, as we all know, FERC issued Order 1920. The rule requires transmission providers to look ahead 20 years and engage in scenario-based long-term transmission planning. The rule also reinstates a right of first refusal for right-sized projects. While there will be much to do to implement this order, Wires members look forward to constructively working with both FERC and with regional planning entities to ensure the proactive planning of needed transmission. It's clear that we're in a time of ever-evolving threats to the system and ever-increasing customer demand. Every day, our news is filled with reports of the long-term challenges to the grid due to factors such as electrification, electric vehicle penetration, and data centers. A recent Bank of America global research estimate of the additional electricity demand from AI computing suggests an additional 18 to 28 gigawatts of electricity capacity will be required by 2026, which is kind of a staggering number.
That's a staggering number.
At Wires, we are here to help meet these challenges and advocate for solutions. We play a unique role in the conversation about what the 21st century grid needs to look like. And system reliability will always be mission critical for Wires members. With that, it's a good segue. My pleasure to introduce you to our keynote speaker this morning. We're honored to be joined today by Jim Robb, President and CEO of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. Jim assumed this role in 2018, overseeing NERC's mission of assuring the reliability and security of the North American bulk power system, which includes overseeing the operations of 6 regional entities that report to NERC and the activities of approximately 1,400 bulk power system users, owners, and operators. Jim has more than 35 years of experience in the energy sector. He's been the CEO of the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, or WEC, and has held senior leadership roles in the industry, including Senior Vice President at Northeast Utilities, which is now Eversource, Senior Vice President at Reliant Energy, which is now part of NRG, and as a partner at the consulting firm McKinsey & Company. In his role as the CEO of NERC, Jim has focused on the evolution of the electric power system, cybersecurity, integration of variable generation, and the increasing interdependency of electric and natural gas reliability. Jim earned a bachelor's degree from Purdue University and an MBA from the Wharton School of Business. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn things over to you.
Great. Great. I'm going to use the law. So thank you, Jody. That's a very kind introduction. Larry, I appreciate the invitation to be here. I would say that 35 years is starting to wear on me, And in 2018, I had a full head of hair and my shirt was tight in the chest, not in the waist. So it's taken a toll at NERC as well. Anyway, I appreciate the chance to visit with you this morning. It's very helpful for me always to kind of share our perspectives on kind of what we see the state of the industry being and where it's headed, and get some calibration with those active in the industry, whether it's resonating, and also if there are issues that you're seeing that we're not paying as much attention to as we should. That's always helpful for me too. I always like to start off when I talk with folks that you know, we are in a pretty amazing period of time for the electric grid because of the pace of change that we're seeing, and the fact that it's coming at the grid in a number of different directions at the same time. So we're having to rethink a lot of things. We're having to kind of, I don't want to say invent new physics, but we're having to understand physics in ways that we haven't had to do before, and that's made our mission quite challenging. You know, we were originally formed. You know, Larry knows this. We talked about this at dinner last night. We were originally formed to address all the issues related to the blackout, right? You know, which is all kind of good spinach utility operations. You know, vegetation management, situation awareness, training, communications, that sort of thing. And now we're into a lot of very frontier issues where, as I said, we kind of need to understand the science at the same time we're trying to draft requirements, and that's obviously challenging all of us to rise to the occasion. But we are in many great ways. I think it's always, because the policy world gets a lot of attention here, and I think it's always good to remind ourselves how difficult energy policy is. Because energy policy fundamentally always has to balance three competing dimensions, right? We always have to be paying attention to for customers' ability to access and afford energy. So access and affordability is very, very important. Reliability and security of energy is very, very important, because you want to be able to, because it's so fundamental to everything that we do as a society that, one, we both need to be able to afford it, we need to be able to access it, but it's got to be there when we want it. And that is increasingly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. And as you all know, the morning you get up and you flip the white light switch and the lights don't come on is kind of the definition of a bad day in the 21st century. And then the third competing interest is we have to pay attention to the sector's environmental footprint and the sustainability of the sector. You know, there's no doubt that the electric sector, by its very nature, causes significant environmental damage. Right? We occupy a tremendous amount of land mass. We consume a lot of resource in terms of water resources, critical minerals, land use, and so forth. And we have, you know, significant emissions, you know, carbon as well as other priority pollutants. So, you know, we always got to make sure that we're kind of paying attention to that aspect of the business as well. And where the industry gets in, and where the policy gets in trouble is when we overweight one of those dimensions and not pay attention to the implications on the other two, because they all work at cross purposes, right? We could build a really, really cheap electric system, right? But it probably wouldn't be reliable, and it probably would have an environmental impact we don't like, right? We could build a 100% reliable system, but we probably wouldn't be able to afford it, and we may not like its environmental impact. We could build a zero environmental impact electric grid, maybe, but we probably wouldn't be able to afford it, and it probably wouldn't be reliable to the extent that we need. So we always need to keep those in balance. And I think a lot of people would say over the last 10 to 15 years, we may have overweighted one of those legs to the detriment of the other two, and we're in a process now of trying to refine balance. And that's what I think our work as NERC has been able to help catalyze as a conversation around the reliability of the system and how that plays against kind of all the environmental all the environmentally policy-driven changes that we've seen to the sector. So. I mentioned the fact that it's a time of rapid change. And by the way, I'm planning to talk for about 15 minutes, right? And then take questions. So I should have said that at the beginning. We think about the kind of the risk landscape facing the industry as kind of having four really, really important dimensions. And in our risk report last year, we added a fifth, which was policy. But policy kind of permeates the other three, or three of the other four. But the first one is the transition of the resource base. You know, we clearly are coming through a period of time where we are retiring the traditional generation that's been the workhorse of the sector, right? So the old coal plants, steam plants, nuclear plants, events, all have been under economic pressure and environmental pressure, and we've seen a significant number of retirements of those resources that have occurred and are planned, and another large tranche that's certainly at risk. You know, and the problem with, and we're replacing those resources with largely variable resources, wind and solar. If you look at the interconnection queues across the country, two stunning things about them. One, they're now twice the size of the existing resource base of the country, right? So 2 terawatts of projects notionally, we know there's a lot of double counting in that, you know, trying to compete to get interconnected onto the grid that has about 1 terawatt of existing capacity today. So that 2-to-1 ratio is stunning, right? Typically the aggregate interconnection queues are about half to a third of the installed base. So that shows how much investor interest there is at some level in new generation resources. The other thing that's stunning is almost all of them are wind, solar, with a smattering of batteries. A little bit of gas, no coal, no nuclear of any consequence, no hydro. So it's very, very clear that as we move forward, the lion's share of new additions we'll see on the grid will be largely variable resources. And that brings with it a couple issues. You know, one is just dealing with the variability and the uncertainty of fuel supply for those resources. You know, some of that we know, right? We know the sun's not going to shine at night, so we can plan around that. But we don't always know when it's going to be sunny, when cloud cover could form, you know, where wind is going to be. We had an extraordinary event June 6th last year, where across the backbone in North America, there's about 60 gigawatts of installed wind capacity from Saskatchewan down to West Texas. June 6th last year, 300 megawatts showed up. We were fortunate because it was early June, right? So loads weren't really high. It didn't create a reliability event. But had a wind drought like that occurred in, say, August on a Tuesday afternoon, right, we would have had really significant trouble from Chicago down to El Paso. So we got to be able to deal with those kinds of fuel shortages when we're dealing with variable generation. Those are very, very hard to predict. The second issue with variable resources is unlike traditional generation, where you make electricity by boiling water, making something spin, right? You get kilowatt hours, but you also get all those things we call essential reliability services. You get voltage, you get frequency response, you get all these things that allow the grid to operate stably. Well, you don't get those naturally from the power electronics that the variable generation interconnects onto the grid with. So we got to be paying close attention to the ability of the grid to operate stably as we take away all these resources that have been both kind of the producers of a large number of kilowatt hours, but also those reliability services that keep the grid operating stably. So there's a lot of wood to chop in terms of thinking about how we're going to recreate those services with a very, very different resource mix through power electronics than the spinning mass generation that we've been dealing with for the last 100 years. The second issue that's challenging the grid is just the evolution of the weather patterns that it has to operate under. And weather's, you know, increasingly important to the grid because now it not only impacts load, in some cases deliverability if you're dealing with a hurricane or something like that that takes out a lot of infrastructure, but now it also impacts your ability to generate because weather is the fuel supply that we're dealing with. And there's no doubt that we've seen a step change in extreme weather conditions over the last 10 years or so. You know, these have been both, you know, super hot summer heat dome events. We've had several in California. Last year, the lower third of the continent had a heat dome sitting over it that lasted about 3 months with 100-degree temperatures in places like Houston where it's not really supposed to get into triple digits all the time. We've seen these massive cold events like Uri, Elliott, Jerry, and Heather earlier this year. And we characterize these events as being broader, deeper, longer. Broader in terms of the area of the continent that it impacts. That has a lot of implications for utilities being able to rely on neighboring systems because they're likely to have the same weather pattern that you have. Speaks to the question of the value and the cost of interregional transfer capacity as a vehicle for dealing with that. Longer in terms of duration. I mentioned a 3-month heat dome last year. And deeper. You know, we're seeing colder temperatures where we're not used to seeing them, and hotter temperatures where we're not used to seeing them. And all those create issues for us to plan around, because most of our planning models are backward looking, right? And that works great if you're in a static environment, but in a world where these patterns absolutely seem to be changing, right? Thinking about how we plan for the future, I think is a real quandary. The third issue that's obviously challenging the grid is growth. You know, for the longest period of time, we had very little growth in the electric sector because of our, our ability to implement energy efficiency solutions, kind of natural things like appliance turnover and natural productivity gains in the end-use sectors. So we've really seen very little change in electricity consumption over the last, 15 years or so. Last year, when we did our long-term reliability assessment, was the first time we started to see the impact of electrification showing up in utility forecasts. Both building electrification as well as electric transport, repatriation of some industry that had left the country in the 90s, so forth, did not at all contemplate the data center issues that we're now talking about and could be, as Jody pointed out, potentially a 30–40% increase in load over the next 5 years, notionally, right? It's going to be very, very hard to actually serve that, given the infrastructure development constraints that we're going to be under. But we haven't really dealt with growth as an industry in a very, very long period of time. We've been focusing on taking the largesse that we built in the 70s and 80s, working that out through competitive markets to create a more efficient system, which we've done a great job at. But now trying to figure out how we're going to turn that around and grow the system, while at the same point in time kind of turning over the resource base and doing this in the context of the weather systems I talked about. Pretty daunting challenge for us. And then the last thing that I always have to mention, I won't spend a ton of time on this, but we're also living in an absolute toxic soup of security threats. And I think over the last 4 years, the threat environment, both for physical and cybersecurity, has really changed. And that's true whether we're talking about the big 4 nation-state adversaries, Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, or the organized cyber criminals that they sometimes sponsor, and even the punks, thugs, and crooks that everybody has to deal with. It's a very, very complicated world. It's driven by the fact that software is embedded everywhere. We rarely know exactly where the coding came from. The National Institute of Standards Technology Testing, they publish a list of vulnerabilities, and it's averaging like 60 a day. So if you think about that, once they publish that there's a vulnerability in a certain software package, every CISO in the country has to go figure out, am I exposed to it? Is it a big deal? How do I mitigate it? And the great thing is that once we know, so do the bad guys. So it becomes a foot race, right, to figure out how to defend against it while they're trying to figure out how to exploit it. And that shows no sign of abating. We also, in 2019, there was a cyber-related event using on a software package called SolarWinds. I'm sure you all heard of. Complete game changer in terms of thinking about cyber risk, because we always thought cyber criminals and cyber adversaries had to solve what we called a one-to-one problem, where in order to corrupt any particular asset, you had to deal with that asset directly. And so we didn't really pay a lot of attention to the notion of coordinated, the term we use is coordinated attack. Well, with a product like SolarWinds, and as we saw last week with CrowdStrike, right, you have one package that's used ubiquitously throughout industry, whether it's electric sector or more broadly. Not only does that system become compromised, but all of its customer systems can become compromised too. So it takes a one-to-one problem and turn it into a one-to-many solution. So we got to think differently about coordinated attack on the cyber side. Same's true on the physical side. The attacks that we saw in Moore County, North Carolina in December of 2022. Again, we had an adversary, We don't know who. They haven't figured out who did. But whoever was behind that, took out 2 substations that affected 3 others on a loop and resulted in 40,000 customers in North Carolina, losing power during a fairly cold period of time in December. So, thinking through kind of physical security of the system, and we've seen similar types of attacks in Idaho and in the Seattle-Tacoma area, kind of following on the heels of the Moore County things. So thinking about kind of the ability of adversaries to, physically attack different pieces of infrastructure and be able to create a wider spread event is also of increasing concern. So we got to be paying really, really close attention to our physical and cyber hygiene. If you add all that up, that's what gives kind of rise to these maps that we've been publishing over the last 4 to 5 years. And I remember in 2018 was the first time we published our risk map for the continent, and it had a little bit of color. It was down in Southern California, really driven around kind of the gas issues that we were seeing with the Aliso Canyon and the variability of the generation fleet there. And every year we've poured that map, we see more and more areas of the continent seeing higher and higher levels of risk. Over the next 10 years, we see the MISO area footprint in the middle of the country being at high risk. Meaning that they don't have enough reserves to be able to meet their 1 in 10 planning criteria. And by the way, I think we're all kind of come to the point of view that 1 in 10 is an insufficient metric in and of itself. Another kind of 2/3 of the country we characterize as orange. That's most of the West, New England, some parts of Canada. And that's really driven by the fact that while they may have enough resource relative to normal conditions, if they were ever hit with an extreme weather system like a Uri, like a Heather, like an Elliott, right, that they would be potentially at risk of not being able to serve load. And that view of the world is based on about 83 gigawatts of planned retirements and load growth, which in our next iteration will certainly be much higher as we bake in the data center loads. There's another 100 gigawatts of generation, mostly coal, largely in the PJM, Mid-Atlantic South area, which we characterize right now as having kind of normal energy risk. We'll almost certainly put those areas into the high-risk category as well, if those retirements get solidified. So there's not a lot of good news in that, particularly when you think about the fact that electricity, I love this quote from Tom Fanning at the Southern Company, electricity is about 5% of the economy, but it's the first 5%, because without juice, nothing else works. So we really got to be paying attention to this. If I leave this story there, I never get invited back. One of the things we've kind of talked through and worked through with some of the RCs in the country is, what could be a path through this, very, very challenging period of time. And I think it starts with recognizing that, loads are going to be growing. And as loads grow and as we electrify more and more aspects of our lives, right, that our tolerance for outages is going to go to zero. It's already pretty close to zero right now as it is. But now if you think about transportation, all the building electrification that's being talked about and so forth, our tolerance for outages is going to be almost zero as we go forward. So with keeping that in mind, we kind of see 4 elements that I think are going to be really, really important. First of all, we got to figure out how to get generation onto the grid. The interconnection queues are largely constipated across the country. There's a large number of projects waiting to get on board, but we really have to figure out how to get new resources onto the grid, and to meet our environmental objectives, they're going to have to be largely low carbon resources. So for the time being, that's going to be largely wind and solar, and hope for a breakthrough on nuclear with small SMR technology, probably being the most likely relatively near-term opportunity for large-scale, low-carbon, reliable supply of energy. But SMRs are a long way off, right? We shouldn't kid ourselves that those are going to show up in the next 10 years at the scale and deployment that we would need for them to really make a difference. Batteries obviously play a role here, but batteries aren't really a generator. They're just a time machine. They move power around. They don't create electricity. The second thing is recognizing that most of that generation that's going to come on the grid is going to largely be wind and solar. Peculiarity of that resource is that you can't move the fuel, you got to move the power. Right, so our ability to invest in transmission, both for reliability purposes, to build resilience, the interregional transfer capacity that I mentioned, will become very, very important, but also to enable new generation to come onto the grid and be able to find its way to load centers, right? Because most of the wind resource is largely in the Midwest. The large-scale solar resources in the desert Southwest, and loads are elsewhere. Right, so development and investment in infrastructure is going to be really, really important. And that gets into the issues around cost allocation, siting and permitting, and planning, all the issues that Order 1920 is trying to address. The third issue is that recognizing that the lion's share of the generation coming on board is going to be variable. We need to be paying really, really close attention to securing the balancing resources that we have to integrate that variable resource reliably. Long term, we may come up with a long duration battery technology that could be useful. Hydrogen in some areas may play a role in that. But right now, really the only way to deal with that is natural gas. And it's not that I love natural gas so much, but I really love natural gas generation. Its ability to operate flexibly on a dispatchable basis. It's highly reliable, 355 days a year. We'll talk about those other 10 days. That's a separate problem. But we really need to kind of secure the gas system. For the electric grid, and we kind of think of these two systems as being increasingly interdependent, interconnected, right? Not just two parallel systems that happen to grow up together and have some marriages of convenience, which is kind of how the gas-electric system started out together, but they're now kind of intimately linked. As I kind of pointed out to the gas guys, electricity is now 40% of gas consumption in the U.S., and the U.S.'s fuel supply is about 40% natural gas. So this notion of kind of gas being able to exist as a parallel but non-integrated part of the system just doesn't work anymore. So we really need to take a fresh look at the gas system as it relates to electricity, recognizing that gas has a number of other very important things it needs to be able to do, but we need to kind of fix that interface and make that work for the benefit of customers. And then the last thing is we really got to be looking at supply chains. If we're going to build out any of this infrastructure that we plan to build, we got to figure out where are we going to get the cable, where are we going to get the transformers, where are we going to get the relays, the switches, the breakers, all the stuff that's going to need to be deployed. And the problem is a lot of that right now is made in countries that aren't necessarily friendly to us. So we got to be paying attention to the software that's embedded in those facilities, and ideally we would repatriate a lot of that industry back to the U.S., which again exacerbates our growth challenge. But supply chain is going to be really, really important, both for stuff, right? The equipment that I mentioned, but also just the energy supply chain. We got to get much, much better at forecasting wind and solar, and particularly disruptions to the fuel supply. We need to have much better situation awareness around fuel availability. And we're trying to attack that right now. I was talking with Mike Nolan, right? We're trying to attack that right now through the notion of energy assurance. And requirements around energy assurance and energy planning. Because the one thing that's really true right now is that capacity is interesting, but it's no longer sufficient in the way that it had been for so many years. So we can't just look at reserve margins. We got to be looking at fuel supply and building our visibility upstream much more with much more precision than we've had to in the past. So that's our four pillars of navigating this. All of those are incredibly hard, and if they weren't, they would have been solved already. So we're clearly torturing a lot of people through our processes to get solutions in place for that. A lot of those issues are outside of our direct authority, right? So we're trying to keep lights shown on them so that those who can take action against them can do so, or at least informed of the opportunities they have in front of them. And some of these are just real conundrums, particularly the gas-electric interface issue, because that's one where nobody owns the problem, but it's owned collectively. And that, I think that's going to continue to be a big challenge for us to address at the ultimate level. But we are seeing some very positive movement on that front as well. So with that, I'm going to shut up. But I'd love to take questions and kind of hear what's on your mind, and I'd be happy to tell you about stuff we're working on that's of interest to you. So,
Turn the mic on. Well, thanks, Jim. That was fantastic. Really appreciate your foreshadowing of our next panel on extreme weather events and impact on transmission. I'm sure folks have a lot of questions. I'm going to go ahead and start first, though.
All right.
What I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on the interregional transfer capability study that NERC is working on. I know the deadline is
looming,
fast approaching, right? For I think it's early December for that report. There's efforts going on both up on the Hill at times. There's efforts going on at FERC from a regulatory perspective. Can you talk a little bit to what level, to what extent is there coordination going on there? To what extent do you see the study feeding into those efforts? Curious to hear a little bit more about what's happening.
Sure. So I'm sure you're all aware of this. We got a little homework assignment from Congress last year to do this assessment of interregional transfer capability and to highlight where prudent expansion of that capability would be warranted. Prudent has turned out to be a fairly challenging word to get our head around, although we're continuing to work it. I guess a couple things on it. One, first of all, this turned out to be an even bigger beast than we thought it was when we started, because nobody's done an assessment like this ever of the scale and magnitude that we're attempting to do. So we spent almost a year just getting basically the tools and the framework and the models in place to do the analysis, and we're now starting to get results. Some of it has been quite challenging because we've broken a few of the planning regions up into smaller ones. For instance, MISO. You obviously need to look at MISO North different than you look at MISO South and look at the transfer capability between them. We also are including the interconnected Canadian provinces, looking at north-south transmission between them. We've also agreed with the Canadians that when we complete the congressional assignment, we're going to take a look at transfer capacity interprovincially in Canada as well, because they're quite interested in what the possibilities might be. The Canadian provinces outside of the east aren't very well interconnected. They're mostly interconnected north-south. What we're looking at is basically a linear programming approach, but what we're looking at is not trying to optimize price or cost, but looking at optimizing reserves, which again is a different lens than others have looked at. The challenge with interregional transfer assessments is that it really has a little bit to do with the wires, but it's got a lot to do with the generating resources in the various planning areas and the loads and the nature of the weather patterns that we're dealing with. So we're doing a lot of scenario analysis using the kind of the big storms that we've seen as ways to pressure test the system. We also have to kind of forecast where we think new generation will come in and what it will look like and how it would be impacted by those weather systems. But we're looking at trying to figure out where during those kind of extreme events would we find areas with surplus, at reasonable proximity to areas that would have deficit, right? And that then starts to define where you might want to interconnect. Some early insights that we've got, one is that interregional transfer capacity is very different summer to winter, as you would probably expect. It's very different as you look around the country. Right, not every region is as interconnected with neighboring systems as others are. And as we look kind of a first pass at where we see opportunity, it's not very evenly distributed either. Right, there are some areas where you'd sit back and say, I'd love to build transmission here, but there's not enough generating resource to have excess to make use of the lines. It's one of the issues we're seeing in New England, for example, right? For a long time, New England relied on Quebec because Quebec was winter peaking, New England was summer peaking, and Quebec usually was long generation when New England was short. So it was very natural to build transmission between the two areas. Well, a couple things. One, Quebec's very quickly turning short. on generation as they continue to electrify their economy. New England is becoming a winter peaking area, like most parts of the country will become. And the weather systems are such that, when New England's in deficit, the likely answer is Quebec's going to be in deficit and New York will be in deficit too. So you got to look at all those dynamics, and that's complicated to work our way through. We just published our first report on it, which really sort of lays the foundations of the analytics that we're doing and some of the basic parameters that we're working against. We'll have another report published in August, which will lay out the current transfer capability assessment between all the kind of a pipe and wire diagram that we've put together. And then come around November, we'll start to have kind of public disclosure around the, where we see, additions being likely valuable. And the report's due to FERC on February 2nd. So we're doing this in a very open, transparent way. We've got lots of industry engagement through various advisory bodies and so forth. There's not going to be a lot of time from the time we kind of publish our draft report to when we have to file it at FERC, so I'm encouraging everybody to try to engage in the webinars that we're having to get points of view across earlier rather than later, because there's not going to be a lot of review time at the end of this. FERC obviously will have its own comment period once we deliver the report to them, so there'll be an opportunity there to weigh in. We have an election between now and then, so that could color a little bit about how this process plays out. But the other point you raised, Larry, is that this is not going to be the end-all assessment. This is, I think, an important piece, and there are a variety of DOE, ESI has published a study of not this looking at the issue the same way, but has looked at where they think transmission could be built. ESIG just published a kind of a national study. We're actually using the same modeling firm that they use, so fairly common set of assumptions. Again, looking at the problem through a slightly different lens. So I think this will be an important piece of the answer to kind of where we ought to be developing interregional transmission. Won't be definitive in and of itself. But we have been keeping FERC very, very close to us, because they got to take the baton in February and run with it where they go. So,
great.
Long-winded answer, sorry.
All right, I didn't have to wait long for that. Here you go, Brian. Hold on.
Brian Gemmell with National Grid. Thank you for that. The engineer in me agrees with all of that, and I think where all the utilities are living that. I know it's perhaps not NERC's kind of specialty, but when I think of this, and I wonder if you've been thinking about with the risks, where are all the people going to come from to do this work? And how are you thinking about affordability of the bill impacts or taxpayers' impacts for all of the above that you laid out, and so thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, I think people gets to, I should have mentioned that, that's a core part of the supply chain problem, right, is having the resources to be able to do the work in addition to the equipment and all that kind of stuff. Don't have a solution to that, right, but obviously, attracting people to the sector, and I think we are seeing a new generation of people come into the sector to kind of replace the guys like me coming in. So I think that's encouraging, but the volume is going to be very, very important. I think on the bill impact, we're not an economic regulator, so that's not our kind of the number one thing we look at. But I do think that we need to stop telling people that this is going to be cheap. Right, because there has been, a lot of the single issue advocates saying, free fuel, what could be better than that? With the amount of capital that's going to need to be deployed, I think I saw a number of $165 billion in the U.S. from EEI next year. I don't know what the revenue requirement of that is, but it's large. So there's going to be a lot of new capital being put to bear. Obviously, the renewable stuff doesn't have a fuel cost and much variable cost, but it's got a lot of capital recovery embedded in that. Freshening up the transmission system is going to drive rate pressure all over the place. And we're just going to have to get used to the fact that the days of 10, 12 cent power are kind of gone. And I don't know whether we're going to 20, 25 cent per kilowatt hour power, but that's probably where we would end up if we did everything that we wanted to do, maybe even north of that. Look at where California rates are. That's probably a good place to start. And that's obviously going to have a lot of implications for national competitiveness for all sorts of industry that's really thrived because we've had low factor costs in the U.S. So it's going to be a very different world in multiple ways.
Jim, I have a question.
Yeah, Jody.
Given all the challenges that you've articulated, cyber threats, physical security threats, extreme weather, et cetera, what are your thoughts on the NERC standards development process and kind of how, I don't know, you and I have talked about this a little bit.
Yeah.
Does it need to evolve? How would it evolve? What would that look like? Just interested in your thoughts on that.
Boy, that's a big question. First of all, our process is not keeping up, right, with the pace of change, and this isn't because people are bad and so on and so forth, right? I think there's just legitimately a lot of work that needs. The volume is extraordinary. I think right now, I think I was told we have as many standards under development right now as we did when we started the whole thing up, right? With about half the resources on our side kind of working on it. So it's an enormous workload. There's also great issues around we're trying to understand dynamics at the same time we're trying to write requirements. That makes people uneasy. And we're working against, in many cases, FERC established deadlines to get stuff done. So we've got a couple things right now. We've gone several iterations around winterization requirements mostly for generating plants, which many of you have probably followed. That got kicked back to us from FERC last month. They accepted the standard, but needs some revisions done to it. We're going to give industry one round of drafting to try to implement that, and if not, then we'll have to use some of the alternative procedures that were embedded in the NERC model to where eventually the staff will end up taking the pen to write the requirements. We don't like doing that at all, and we're not really excited about that possibility. But if the industry can't get it across the line, we don't really have a lot of choice. We also have a series of things around inverters right now that we're trying to get across the line, and some fairly stiff deadlines that FERC has given us to get the first round of inverter requirements in place. Then we're having a conversation with industry as well on that, saying, look, we want to do these the old-fashioned way because we absolutely believe that the stakeholder model around standard development results, one, in better standards and quicker implementation, because they tend not to get litigated on the back end, the way an EPA requirement or many other executive branch regulations do. So we would love to get it done that way. But at the same point in time, the board has also signaled that we're going to get them done. And so if we need to move to Section 321 of our bylaws, if any of you are NERC groupies, where it kind of specifies a couple alternative processes for moving things along. I don't see this problem going away. One of the big challenges we have, as I said, when we were formed, all of our stuff was geared around known issues and was really kind of codifying utility best practices, and largely focused on the transmission system and the operators and planners of it. The risks over the last several years have migrated to the fringes, right? It's in the generation segment. It's stuff on the distribution system or lower voltage transmission lines. So we're also engaging different communities, right, that haven't been as well embedded in NERC processes as the transmission owners and operators have been. So that's also a challenge as well. I don't see an easy path out of this, other than, given the importance of the electric grid and the gravity of some of these issues, I'm committed that we're going to get them done.
Hi, Sandy Grace with National Grid. You talked about the importance of the gas system to electric reliability. What are your thoughts in terms of how you see NERC's involvement in getting planners to plan the gas and electric systems in a more integrated fashion? And to the extent you've had, dialogues with policymakers and regulators about that, how receptive would you say they are to thinking about more integrated system planning?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to invoke Chatham House rules, if that's okay. So there's been a big turn in the gas sector over the last 2 years. Where for the longest period of time, I think the attitude we got out of the gas sector was a little bit of don't bother us. Everything buy firm and don't bother us, we'll take care of it. But I think over the last year and a half, we've seen a change in their openness to reconsider some of the ways the two sectors work together. It's very, very hard because the gas sector is not a sector. Right, you've got distribution, you got the distribution companies, you've got the midstream pipelines, and then the processing facilities, and you've got the production sector. You know, the midstream is somewhat regulated, but by several different regulators. There's no one body that has oversight across the whole system, and the upstream is barely regulated at all, except through OSHA and the like. If you look at the problems we've had with gas electric, part of it is infrastructure planning. A big chunk of it is system performance during cold weather events. So, if you look at the Elliott report, 30% of the Marcellus gas froze off, half of the Utica gas froze off, and they're kind of facing a similar situation as we were, right? When the gas system was kind of formed and policies were all put in place, gas was largely produced on the Gulf Coast, right? So you didn't really have severe concerns around winter weather the way you do now that gas production's migrated to the Dakotas and Pennsylvania and New York and the like. So they're dealing with their own set of issues around that. Several of the gas trades and the merchant generation trades, they've gotten together to talk through some things that they think they could do. The RTOs have put forward a series of recommendations. NARUC's now got a task force looking at this. NASB put in place an effort that came up with 22 recommendations. So there's no shortage of ideas here, right? I think the issue is really around how to get traction against putting some real leadership and executive oomph behind getting them done. And on that one, I'm also starting to see the executives of the gas sector more open to working collegially with the electric sector to try to get some of these things done. So I think that's all very, very encouraging. I think one of the things that has been proposed, I don't know whether it's going to come out from the NARUC effort, the GEAR task force, is modeled on a structure they put in place in Texas called the Texas Energy Reliability Council or something like that, or TERC. And it's largely meant to be a convening body when they have an event to get the electric sector, the gas sector, the PUCT, in this case the Railroad Commission who oversees the gas sector, all in a convening forum to kind of share situation awareness, which is very challenging during these cold weather events, and also, right, to make whatever decisions they can make to help, avoid a Uri type event. There's a lot of merit to that. And I think what I've heard is that the GEAR task force is looking at recommending putting something like that in place nationally that you would invoke during one of these impending cold weather events. My hope is a forum like that could also turn into one that could start to sponsor longer term joint infrastructure planning. Ultimately, I think you're going to end up having to have some sort of a NERC type structure over gas, that's independent of the industry, also independent of the government, that can, with objectivity, assess the needs of the two sectors. I think we're a long, long way from anybody being prepared to sign up for that. But I think ultimately that's where we end up. But I'm seeing some very positive steps toward solving some of those issues.
Good morning. Julia Freyer with London Economics. You mentioned, I hope I wrote it down correctly, but I think at the beginning, 1 in 10 is insufficient. And let me know if I misquote. But what are you thinking about that in terms of kind of resource adequacy in a world of transition? So
there's a great paper that we just published jointly with the National Academy of Engineering on our website. And I'll refer you to that, because that was a kind of a who's who of both academics and leading kind of transmission system planners around the industry. And I started with the premise that 1 in 10, when it was developed by PJM, I think, in the late 50s, early 60s, but that was when we had a metal bending economy and, largely oil and coal generation. Clearly not the economy we have today and clearly not the generation fleet. And given the importance of electricity and how it's evolved over time, 1 in 10, one load loss event in 10 years is probably too much risk for the economy to bear. What we concluded through that workshop is that's probably going to be very, very hard to change that planning construct. But we did come back and says we ought to be augmenting it, because what you really want to know is not how often are you going to have an event, but how big of an event is it, how many people are impacted, and for how long. So what this paper lays out very simply is kind of a proposal to augment the 1 in 10 loss of load event with a duration and an impact measures, and start to have a broader set of metrics that we can look at to say, do we like this risk profile or not? And then to come up with a relatively standardized way of assessing those so that policymakers can make reasonable judgments around it.
Well, I clearly didn't allocate enough time to this presentation because I think it could go on quite a bit longer beyond this, but I want to be respectful of your time, Jim, and I really appreciate you doing it. Really appreciate the work that you and your staff are doing at NERC. It's critically important. And I also appreciate your honesty with some of your comments, particularly about the needs associated with building out the grid and the cost that's going to be required in order to do it. One last thing I wanted to ask you about, you actually look awfully well rested to me, and I think if I had your job, I'm not sure I would be quite as able to sleep at night. I guess my question ultimately is, I'm sure you've had this one before. What is it that keeps you up at night? What is your biggest concern from a reliability perspective?
It's a great question, and I think the answer has to be the threat landscape on security, because dealing with the reliability issues that we've talked through, when those will play out over time, and those are kind of stochastic events, right? The problem with security is you've got determined adversaries, right, that are trying to do you harm all the time, 24 hours a day, and it's not a fair fight, right? The way we've organized ourselves is that each electric company has to defend itself against nation-state armies, right? I mean, the People's Liberation Army has literally an army, right, of cyber hackers who are trying to get into our systems and do mischief and plant capabilities for the really bad day. So that has to be the scariest thing right now. With the physical security events we had in 2022, those were very, very sobering. And I think if you think about the volatility we're going to see over the next 6 months with the election cycle, potentially, there will be an administration change given the Biden's decision to drop out. That's just going to be very, very scary for this country. And everyone's going to have to be top of their game. Both the intelligence community and companies like ours that play a key role in translating government intelligence into actionable things for industry to do to mitigate risks as they emerge. But the physical security threats to the grid are real and increasingly consequential, and the cyber threat is just very ever present and existential.
Well, everyone, please join me in thanking Jim Robb for being here today.
I would have liked to have ended on a more positive note, but anyway, I really appreciate the chance to be here.